Steve Schneck, the Director of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies, and this is the fourth in our series of faculty seminars on, the sound still working okay?
I don't think the mic is picking up the mic.
How's this?
Okay.
I just have to bend over. This is the fourth in our spring series of faculty seminars on Catholic social thought, and we have already gone through a very wonderful first discussion on subsidiarity, a second discussion, which has to be the best since I was one of the speakers, on the common good. A third discussion just recently on solidarity, and this is our concluding discussion for this spring semester on the dignity of the human person. This has been just a wonderful series, well attended. We've just enjoyed it a ton. I have been asked by the provost to see if we could, in fact, continue this kind of series in the fall semester, and I hope to do so. So I look forward to another series of seminars on Catholic social teachings in the fall semester as they relate to public policy. The provost, unfortunately, cannot be here today. He usually gives the introduction to these events, but he's in the midst of an important meeting in the School of Theology and Religious Studies today, and so he begs off. And so I think at this time ready to turn this over to the panel. We have three distinguished speakers today. Father Anthony Fogarells of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies and also from Theological College. Professor Linda Plitt Donaldson of the University School of Social Work and also a fellow at the Institute, and someone that I hope will soon be a fellow at the Institute, Father Brian Johnston of the School of Theology and Religious Studies. All right, guys, take it away.
It's my job to begin with dignity. So, what does dignity mean? I will start with a story of Robinson Crusoe. There he is, all alone. Now, the philosopher Simon, in an essay on the dignity of the human person, says that Robinson Crusoe, all alone on his island, had dignity but no rights. You think of that. This is what I want to discuss. He says he would have potential rights, but he would only have actual rights if someone else was there with him on the island. Now, as you know in the story, that eventually there was somebody else. This is a copy of the cover of the book. It's rather mysterious. It says, as we might be able to see, he was utterly alone and trapped in an epic battle for survival. But he's not alone. As you can see, there's a person called Man Friday in the background. Now, Seifert would say, as soon as Man Friday comes on the scene, Robinson Crusoe's potential rights become actual. But by himself, he has no actual rights, but he does have dignity. Now, the point of insisting that Robinson Crusoe as a person has dignity is to insist that dignity is intrinsic. It is not something conferred by anybody else. You have your dignity. Now, I suggest that's not completely satisfactory. For one thing, it doesn't explain how you move from having dignity to having a moral claim on somebody else. Or, to put it in other words, if we describe the dignity you have by reason of your nature, why is it that you have some claim on me to respect your dignity? not explained. That's what I want to try to do. How? In Christian theology, we have the notion that we are created in the image of God. I'm sure you expected this to be the fundamental notion. But I want to develop a particular aspect of that. What is it about us that is the image of God? Is it our intellect or free will or whatever? It is often said. I suggest a slightly different way of thinking about it. St. Thomas said that what's happening here? Is that better?
Yes.
I see. The proper name for God is gift, St. Thomas says, specifically the Spirit. We encounter God through the Spirit. So we might think of God as giving, and we could even think of God as in some sense receiving and giving if we were to move into the thought of the Trinity, as the speaker last week did. So that I suggest that being in the image of God means to be receiving and giving. Now, let's try to follow that idea through. We are, by our created being, receivers. We receive our being from God as a gift. That gift makes us capable of giving gifts to others, so that we are gifted givers, and that is our nature. That's the basic proposition I would offer. Now, the next step is that we choose to be gifted givers. We don't constitute ourselves as gifted givers. We choose to be, and that, you could say, is our fundamental choice. Now, because I choose to be a gifted giver, I am enabled to recognize others who as receivers. And therefore, I ought to respect your dignity. That's my suggestion of how ought comes into it. And if I do not, then I negate my own dignity. So those are the points I've made already. So here, I suggest dignity is relational in the sense that I recognize your dignity and I ought to recognize it because I have chosen to be a gifted giver. I've referred to ontological dignity. That means the dignity you have because of your nature. And your moral dignity is the reason you have to call upon my response. Now, that notion of dignity would make sense to someone who believes in God. Can we make this notion intelligible for someone who doesn't believe in God at all? I suggest we could. If we think of we used to speak of the great chain of being. I suggest it's not simply a matter of the great chain of being. It's a great chain of receiving and giving. So if you think about it, you are carrying the understood mitochondria. We are carrying in some way what is the gifts of other living beings, going back to the whole history of evolution. So we are gifted in that fundamental existence sense. We owe something to the first Homo erectus, possibly. So this notion that I'm suggesting doesn't simply make sense for believers. Now, if we go back to Robinson Crusoe, if Robinson Crusoe refuses to recognize the dignity of Man Friday, he negates his own dignity. Not his ontological dignity, but his moral dignity. embryo, the human embryo from the beginning, obviously cannot ratify or choose to be a gifted giver. Nonetheless, the human embryo is one who, by reason of his or her being, can receive gifts in such a way as to become one who can give gifts. And that is the basis, I suggest, of the dignity of the embryo, which I ought to recognise in the embryo from the very beginning of its existence. We might want to discuss that further, since that raises all kinds of difficult questions. Now, the next step would be to connect dignity with rights. Now, in these thoughts, I am using the notion of gift and drawing on the philosophy and theology of gift, which comes from, in part, Caritas in Veritate, Trinity, and then before that, the philosopher Levinas and the contemporary philosopher Marion. I can't explain the connections here, but that's where I'm searching. Now, this is what makes us, I say, the image of God. Just so. We are gifted givers. Now, let's move on to the question of rights. This is again a summary of what I said already. Okay. Now, the question of rights. Love is the basis of giving of gifts, and Thomas says that the proper action of love is the giving of gifts. But the giving of gifts requires justice. So the role of justice is a virtue which moves us to construct structures to protect the giving and receiving of gifts. Fundamental relationship is the giving and receiving of gifts. The second level is that of justice. We are required by the logic of love to construct patterns of justice. Among those are rights. So rights are not entities which exist somehow in the stratosphere. We ought to construct rights. And I think that might give us a way of responding to the critique of rights from a philosopher like Alistair MacIntyre. Rights don't somehow emanate from the nature of human beings. We ought to construct rights. So, as I said. So if we go back then to Robinson Crusoe and Man Friday, as soon as Friday comes on the scene, both are required by justice to establish a pattern of rights. Fundamentally, of course, Friday ought recognise Robinson's right to life. Robinson ought recognise Friday's right to life. But that recognition is based upon that fundamental reality of their both being givers and receivers of gifts. So my point is that dignity is a relational term. And just to conclude, Robinson had on the island with him before Friday came some animals. He had his parrot. After great research, I found his parrot was called Poll. And he had a dog whose name I couldn't find, and a goat. Now, could we say that there was a relationship of rights between Robinson, Friday, and the animals? This raises the whole question of animal rights. I suggest, in a sense, we could. They are in a relationship of giving and receiving. Therefore, they ought to establish a certain pattern of rights. How would that turn out? Well, a right to a certain feeding time, a right to proper food. So, we can bring them into the pattern of rights. Well, to go back, the fundamental idea is the notion of gift, which yields the notion of basic relationships as those of giving and receiving, relationships of love, which requires justice, which requires rights. So dignity is not a term which attaches to
discussion of dignity, it would be important to bring in, I think, a population of folks who I think are even a subclass among the poor. I did a research study on the people who were homeless and their experience of the sniper attacks. You may remember those back in 2002 when the snipers were going around and we were all ducking while we gave gas. Well, people really weren't considering how are people who are homeless experiencing the sniper attacks. During Katrina, we heard a lot about the people who became homeless after Katrina, but we really didn't talk a lot about the people who were homeless during Katrina. And when a lot of folks from the hurricane were relocated to D.C., there was a lot of tension within the homeless community by people who had been homeless for years on the streets and saying, oh my gosh, why is it that there's one group of worthy people who are homeless and there's we who have been struggling on the streets. So I wanted to talk about this idea of dignity in the context of homelessness. Because, and I love the way that Brian talked about this, that dignity is inherent, but it's also found in relationship with others. And it's in that we are, how did you put it? We are gifted givers. And people who are homeless, even in the midst and the struggle of their homelessness, are gifted givers. I know we often think of them as receivers, as we pass them on the metro, right? But they're gifted givers. Anyway, so we're applying Catholic social teaching to public policy. So that's the role that I'm doing here. So just to remind you that homelessness is a big problem in our country. That the latest count, 1.56 million people over the course of the year experience homelessness. 2/3 of them are kids, by the way. A big portion of them. This is from the federal HUD strategic plan for homelessness. Some of the numbers there. And then if you look at our own community here in D.C., okay, thank you. Oh, thanks, Paul. On a single night, we have about 600 to 500 people who are experiencing homeless. And you should remember that homelessness is undercounted, right? There are a lot of people who remain invisible. A lot of families who are afraid to reveal their homeless situation, fear of losing their children. A lot of singles that hang out in places, abandoned buildings, back alleys that aren't always accounted for when we go out every January and do the counts, right? January is also not a great time to do counts because a lot of jurisdictions have shelters and have laws that require people to be housed during cold weather. But anyway, I want to show you that homelessness is increasing. It's increasing in our city, and it's really increasing for families. I think we are kind of in the perfect storm for homelessness for families. The foreclosures, the recession, the lack of jobs have created great problems for our families. Just to go back to our Catholic documents, our social teaching, and where this comes from. Brian talked about it, but just reminding us, that our teaching talks about us being created in the image of God, that our whole social doctrine affirms that we have inviolable dignity, and that God shows no partiality, right, in identifying, who's worthy of dignity and who isn't. And I wanted to lift up that our documents, the Catholic social tradition talks about people with disabilities. They give specific mention of people with disabilities as being fully human subjects of their own stories, right? We are fully human subjects regardless of our ability. And that we should be helped to participate in every dimension of social life. They need love, to be loved. They need tenderness, closeness, and intimacy. All of that is speaking to the relational nature of experiencing dignity from others. I think the issue of disabilities is important because the experience of people with disabilities is prominent in the homeless population, as you can imagine. So in our own city, mental illness, with chronic health problems, being on the street. You know, if you're living on the street, walking, well, I used to work for some for 10 years, so others might eat. And in our clinic, we always had a podiatrist that came in because of the chronic foot problems, diabetes, and so on and so forth, issues that people experience. But I also want to tell you that 24% of our folks who are homeless are employed. So for people who value working as the most important way of giving, some of them are giving, but they're also giving in other extraordinary ways as well. So just building on what Brian is saying, so not only does our tradition talk about us being people of dignity, it also talks about the fundamental social nature of who we are, right? That we were not created as solitary, but that we are created to be in relationship. That it is only in relationship where we can live and develop our gifts, right? That's how we realize and recognize the dignity within each of us. So, the underlying, for somebody who is working with people who are homeless and crafting public policy for and with people who experience homelessness, we might come to that, using Catholic social teaching, we might come to that with these set of assumptions, right? That all people who are homeless are created in the image of God, that they are capable of giving, that they too recognize and realize their worth in relationship with others. You might doubt that because you might see a lot of people who are struggling with schizophrenia and wonder, well, how could they relate with others? But the research shows that they can and they do, and it is important. And then, so what our policy should be doing is helping people who are homeless recognize their dignity and helping them to do that in a way where they can be giving gifts and sharing their capacities. And one of the models, an emerging model, and I might even say that it's not really emerging anymore, although it's not abundant, because our current HUD secretary and the one prior to Obama's administration has labeled the Housing First model for people who are homeless as this is right out of this federal strategic plan, as the solution to ending chronic homelessness. And it's based on the idea that safe, affordable housing is a basic human right. We're getting back to some of the rights language. That housing is important for stabilizing people, on their perhaps mental health medications. It's very hard to take your medication when you're trying to survive, live in the shelter, not sure people are wanting to take your belongings because they don't want to bring in whatever could be living in the bags. Maintaining sobriety. It's hard to stay clean and sober when you might be in an environment where other people are using, and it's a stressful environment to be in. It's hard to address. We dealt with this a lot at some when we had people with diabetes who had to take medication. Just their compliance with diabetes medication was very, very challenging when they were living in shelters and not in housing. That if you house people immediately, then they're able to address those problems. But it's important that you wrap lots of intensive services around that person so they're not there just kind of withering away in housing. And the idea of Housing First is, and why this is so revolutionary, is that your housing is not contingent on complying with services. So in the traditional housing model, you could actually move forward, Paul. Thank you. So it kind of looks like this. You have a person in housing, and you have all these services wrapped around them, right? Social workers, nurses, psychiatrists, addictions counselors, vocational counselors. I think that some models are starting to incorporate peer counselors. I think it's a little bit at the relationship piece beyond just relationships with service providers, which have their limits. So this is what the Housing First model might look like conceptually versus the traditional model, which is the model I grew up in as a social worker. This is the model that was prominent when I started doing social work here in Washington, D.C., where you take people who are on the street, who they might live a long time on the street, but then they develop a relationship with an outreach worker, gets them into shelter, or maybe they'll come into shelter during the winter time, or even during the hot, hot summers. And then from shelter, after some time, they might go into a treatment program, in and out. And then sort of this linear approach. And then from treatment, they go to transitional housing. Of course, transitional housing requires, there are a lot of barriers, 60-year worth of sobriety, absolute, 6-month stabilization on your mental health medications, and so on and so forth, not having visits, curfews, lots of impingements on people, and then you go into permanent housing. So there's this whole linear model that people could be struggling in for years and years and years, and you could move on, until folks said, there's got to be a better way. And Tanya Tull is the first pioneer of Housing First program. She's a social worker, so I love to tell people about her because I think her contribution to Housing First gets overlooked. She started Housing First with families. So Housing First was a model that was developed to support families because really the biggest predictor of homelessness is poverty. So for families, actually, versus people who are chronically homeless that you see on the streets, families don't have the same level of mental health issues, substance abuse. Their main problem is being poor. And the number one cause of homelessness, by the way, is the lack of affordable housing. So what Tanya said is, hey, you know what, really, all these families who are coming to our place at Beyond Shelter in Los Angeles, what they really just need is housing. So let's pilot a program. Just put them into housing and see how they do. And they did great. And follow-up research from Dennis Culhane and others have said, yeah, for families, housing subsidies, he used the word cure. Maybe thought it was a cure. Now, there are some exceptions, right? But for the most part, affordable housing is what families need. Go back. Then you have Sam Sambaris, and he's often the name people hear about. Sam Sambaris took Tanya's model and applied it, the first person to apply it to people who were chronically homeless in the streets of New York City. And he has a PhD, and he started this in 1992. We have Pathways here. It's the biggest provider of Housing First here in the city of D.C. And it's been replicated in 40 cities across the country. And it has been shown to have really good outcomes on a lot of important measures. People are staying in housing longer. They are having lower incidence of mental illness symptomatology. They report a better quality of life. Of course, when they're doing comparative studies, usually the comparative studies are looking at people in Housing First as compared to people living on the street. So you would expect that kind of a quality of life improvement. Lower use, and this is the big thing. This is what helps it to be, I think, very feasible politically. It is proven to save money because when you're putting people in housing, they're calling the emergency room less. They're spending less time in institutions like jails and psychiatric hospitals. So that has resulted in significant cost savings in a lot of studies in public systems. One of the questions that I have about this model, I think this model is a great example of honoring the inherent dignity of people, right? Getting them off the streets, giving them an opportunity to live in a clean place. I have a lot of questions about attending to the relational aspects of dignity. This really first came to light for me when I was meeting with one of the providers, not Pathways, but another new provider of Housing First in the city. And they were telling me that the Mayor Fenty, had called them and said, you need to get these 10 guys off of this main corridor of the city because we're going to have all these people coming in. You need to put them in the Housing First department. And what ended up happening, they usually do an assessment, right? They have what they call a vulnerability assessment. But what you miss out on a quick assessment are some levels of mental illness or mental retardation. And what ended up happening for 3 of these gentlemen is they became preyed upon, right? They were kind of isolated in these scattered site apartments. People were using their apartments for sex, for drugs, and giving them like $5, $5 a week or something, and just really taking advantage of them. So that began to raise questions about issues related to harm, and also it just started making me wonder about, in the implementation of Housing First, how are we attending to relationships, integrating in community, and recognizing that our brothers and sisters who are homeless have something to give. Moving on and concluding, to give time for my other colleague, that I think it does have clear results, that it does give recognition. I guess I already said this, but it raises questions about and dignity is realized in human relationships. And I'll turn it on over to Tony.
Since this series of talks is oriented toward a major symposium on Rerum Novarum, I thought I would actually deal with the text of Rerum Novarum as it relates to the themes of human dignity. And I began by looking at Rerum Novarum in a historical context. And it's important, I think, to look at things in historical context, because one of the things that does is that prevents you from romanticizing things. And I think the history of Rerum Novarum is quite interesting. Now, the Industrial Revolution would have begun in England around 1733. Rerum Novarum came to us in 1891. And Pope Leo XIII was the first pope to address the situation of workers. Now, some of this came out of Leo's own experience. He had been the nuncio to Belgium, where the church indeed would have been interacting with workers in their issues. In some of the other countries of Europe, the church really was not paying that much attention to the situation of workers. In Paris, where there were a lot, the work population was increasing in the cities, not one new parish was created in Paris. In a period when the numbers of workers were increasing to a great extent. So there was a lot of attention not being paid to the situation of workers. So it was only Leo who first addresses this situation, and in a sense was looking at it from a big picture. Leo and the Holy See at that time were concerned about the liberalism of laissez-faire economics, but he also saw that there was the possibility of a tactical alliance with this group. The greater concern were the socialists. And Leo was in many ways very opposed to socialism and its tenets, and felt that it would be necessary for the church to offer a strong opposition to the movement of the socialists. And for the Leonine strategy, Thomism was a key intellectual component. Now, when I talk about the Leonine strategy, this began with Leo, but pretty much was the policy, the approach to social questions of Leo and his next four successors, Pius X, Pius XI, Pius XII, and Benedict XV. With John the 23rd in the early 60s, we see the creation of a new strategy dealing with a more widely global world. But it's interesting also to look at some of the other influences on Leo, who writes Rerum Novarum. We can go to the next one, yeah. Some of the ecclesiastical influences would have been a German bishop by the name of Bishop Emanuel von Kettler of Mainz. He was a strong influence on Leo, and in his own writing, he challenged the individualism of the Enlightenment. He also critiqued economic liberalism. His counterpoint was Aquinas' theory of property, and we've seen in one of our earlier presentations the importance of private property in Catholic social teaching, but it's not an unqualified approach to private property. It rather comes from Aquinas, which is private property with a social component. And again, I think this relates to the whole thing of human dignity as relationship, as relational. That private property is not a possession one holds without some qualifications of good for a wider group than just one's self. Also, what Bishop von Kettler offered was the model of a new welfare state, where there would be benevolent government intervention. And again, one of the things we see very consistently in Catholic social teaching in many, many of its documents in different periods is that the state has a role. Government for Catholics is not the problem. Also, there is a concern about workers' unions and their existence to provide a counterforce to forces that might try to take away workers' rights, might try to take away workers' dignity through the perpetuation of inequality. There are other possible influences on Leo XIII. One was a British cardinal by the name of Cardinal Manning. He was an Anglican convert who was an ultramontanist, so he was very, very supportive of Rome in the face of national movements within the churches. And he would have, I think very succinctly stated where the church needed to be, saying that the future of the church no longer has to do with princes and parliaments, but with the masses. This really stood in contrast to the approach that had been taken before Leo began speaking in 1891. Secondly, the American cardinal, Cardinal Gibbons, who defended the Knights of Labor in the face of potential condemnation from the Holy See. And he too pointed that to lose the hearts of the people would be a misfortune, for which the friendship of the few rich and powerful would be no compensation. I put these up because I think they're very relevant to the issues we deal with today. I mean, I think it's very important to look at the question, where does this church stand in relationship to workers, the lower middle classes, to the poor? I mean, I had, some of you would know better than I. I mean, one very curious thing is, where are Catholic schools continuing to persist? Where are they growing? Anecdotally, I've seen them growing in some of the more wealthy communities. The question is, are they still in the inner cities? Are they still among the poor? Are they still in situations where people who have great needs, are being helped because of the presence of the Catholic Church and its mission there? So I think that's an important question. Where is the church in relationship to the lower classes and the poor? I mean, that question raised in Rerum Novarum is a very timely question for us as well. I think I just like to look at a few of the themes of Rerum Novarum. There are many, and I tried to boil them down into a few things. And perhaps in our discussion, we could develop this a little bit later. But first of all, I think when you look at Catholic social teaching, human dignity is not an abstraction. The documents are concrete. They make concrete prescriptions. It's not ethereal, abstract philosophy. It really does connect to prescriptions for helping people to live in dignity. Of course, one of the themes is private property for all, but it really is. When you look at Rerum Novarum, for all, it's not offering the wealthy the freedom to have the latifundia, and the rest of the people are little sharecroppers. I mean, I think the vision really is that it is good for people to have their homes, to have their neighborhoods, to live a dignified life, having enough, so that indeed they could live with dignity and not live in want. And there's a real connection of a virtuous life emanating from these kind of social conditions. And again, I think it's so important, when we think about, moral issues, that, moral issues, are depend on certain social conditions in order to be lived. I mean, if an impossible ethic is held up, how can it be a valid ethic? And so, I mean, there is a real sense in Catholic social teaching, that physical conditions are important in terms of making it easier, making it possible for people to live virtuous lives. A second piece is the importance of the family. And again, Pope Leo and other documents of Catholic social teaching stress that, the family is a little society. And the family is not to be replaced by, the larger society and its programs. I mean, in a sense, I think this relates to another theme that we had looked at earlier, the theme of subsidiarity. And indeed, families need to have the freedom to make decisions. And again, so much of that is dependent on, some of the physical conditions and resources they have in which to do that. Another thing, just wages and good working conditions. One of the themes was the reality of a Sabbath, that indeed people needed rest. And in our 24/7 world, what does Sabbath mean today? I mean, I think that is an important religious question. It's an important question with ramifications for a lot of areas. But in a 24/7 world, what's the meaning of Sabbath? Again, virtue. And that it is the role of the state, as well as other institutions, to promote human virtue, to make it possible for people to live virtuous lives. Again, the state has a positive role, but with limits. But one of the things, too, for the state is meant to safeguard the interests of the poor and vulnerable. So what does that mean in terms of the debates that are going on in our own country today? An important thing for us to think about, and indeed the church needs to have strategies and responses that safeguard the situation of the poor and vulnerable today. And finally, the importance of associations. Reverend Navarro talks about the guilds and how they promoted workers and the arts and a sense of, not just the bare bones, the bare necessities, but the sense of a high quality of life. And indeed, today, there is a lot of discussion about unions, but perhaps the discussion doesn't go far enough. Perhaps, there really needs to be a discussion of new models of people connecting and organizing, and that there be more, instead of a silo kind of mentality where things are kind of organized according to industry. How can quality of life and quality of work issues be brought together? I mean, one of the things that Berham Novarum also condemns is using situations to promote adversarial relationships. And again, we live in a time that is very much characterized by adversarial situations. How can the teaching of the church and the role of the church invite people to dialogue and collaboration instead of adversarial relationships? I would like to say that there are a couple of papal and episcopal teachings that I think very much stand in the pathway, are in the path of Rerum Novarum. First of all, I think there is soon-to-be Blessed John Paul II's encyclical on human work. And I just pick out one quote there. Human work has an ethical value of its own, which clearly and directly remains linked to the fact that the one who carries it out is a person. I mean, the dignity of work comes from the dignity of the human person. And I think to really know soon-to-be Blessed John Paul II, this is an encyclical you need to know on human work, a key encyclical. And this was, of course, written for the 90th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. For the 95th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, the U.S. bishops wrote a document called Economic Justice for All. This, too, is a very concrete document, was widely discussed throughout the United States, was written really using a process that engaged a strong number of people, and another sector of the church felt free enough to write up a real serious critique of the document. So this document was an important document in terms of social teaching, but also in terms of ecclesiology, of engaging wide sectors of the church to talk about economic life. And there, too, the way the document begins, I think, very much centers on human dignity, saying that every perspective on economic life that is human, moral, and Christian must be shaped by three questions. What does the economy do for people? What does the economy do to people? And how do people participate in it? I think that question is as relevant today as it was when the bishops wrote it in 1986. Thank you.
So, do you all have questions or comments? Yes.
I'd just like to pick up on Father's last point there. Do you think it'd be worth taking a look at 86 and the counter position of conservative Catholic laypersons and revisiting that in terms of the question of dignity and also the strategy and tactics of the Catholic Church today?
I think it would be very interesting to look at in the sense of, okay, what was the context of 86? Where are we today? What did the bishops suggest? What did an alternative position suggest? Where would that lead us? I mean, I think we've got a lot of positions out there, and oftentimes perhaps they're bandied about as different ideological arguments, but perhaps the concrete implications need to be drawn out more clearly. Like, where does this path lead? Where does that path lead? So I think it would be worthwhile to revisit that again.
Thank you.
I'm Thomas, philosopher from Switzerland, and I'm grateful to Catholic University of America to allow me to pass a sabbatical here in Washington. My main question is to the first speaker. I'm very grateful to your clarification of the concept of dignity. But as a philosopher, I have a double question. If I had understood well, you said that the dignity is based in the capacity to become, to be given. You made the example of the embryo, which can already be given something. Would you agree that this criteria can be applied to every animal, every plant, and so on? Also to scorpions, worms, insects, wasps, and so on and so on, because they can be given also, and especially today we are living in a period with a deep ecological crisis. Every day we lose more than 100 species. So they really can be given. My first question is, who has dignity? And then my second question, is it really the criteria to be given or to give? Is a species like ours, who is destroying the whole planet, not only for the destroying the quality of life of not only of future generations but also of other species, is this species really has this species really dignity? That's the question of Roger Gottlieb.
Well, let me try to respond to that question. Well, maybe if I just talk loudly, I'll try that. I would be very much in sympathy with everything you've said. If we take what I would want to emphasize is we have all received. That's the first thing. And we tend to forget that. We've received our life from our parents in the first place. It's absolutely undeniable. And then that pattern of reception goes right back to all animals, to our ancestors, as I would call it, going way, way back. So we have received from all these creatures. So what I've tried to say, I'd just like to see what you think of this. Now, in relation to another person, I recognize the dignity of that other person, which means I recognize them as one who ought receive from me. And that if I refuse to give, I negate my own dignity. So to turn it round, my duty then is to help another to flourish, to become the best kind of being that person is by reason of their nature. Now that would apply also to animals. At least I'll mention a dog. I have a dog, a very nice dog, a German Shepherd. Now I have a duty to that dog to help this dog, Sassy is her name, to become the best kind of German Shepherd she can. Am I audible?
Very well.
Okay. Now how far down the line can you go? That's where it gets difficult. What about scorpions and mosquitoes and things like that? What I said doesn't deal with the reality of conflict, does it? And that is clearly an element. So one way, I'm trying to get evolution into this somehow, that animals have been sacrificed by the millions in the process of evolution. So they have, in a sense, sacrificed to give to me. But then there's the other side of giving is taking. It seems to me the great positive reality is giving. The great sin is taking. And at present, we human beings are involved in massive taking. I totally agree. And I'm trying to find some way of making sense of that. So I totally agree with what you say. I'm still trying to get the ideas necessary to express it. So thank you very much.
Father Johnson, too, I was interested in, and I think you were making a connection, or making the statement that we should be creating rights,
Yes.
if I'm getting that correctly. Well, in light of, for example, Dr. Donaldson's presentation about the tremendous relationality, but also the tremendous need of the homeless, for example, does that then generate a right for the homeless? And if that's the case, there's also in public policy a whole reaction to almost a moratorium on rights and an over-creation of rights. And so, how would that balance out? Just wondered if you had any thoughts on
The
those areas.
basic point, thank you very much. Again, I totally agree. The problem with rights language is that it seems to conceive of rights as things, doesn't it? And then we've got into a situation where everybody's now claiming rights. And there's been a proliferation of rights language which is losing its bite. And on the other hand, you have very socially conscious philosophers like Alistair MacIntyre, who criticizes the very notion of rights. So I was trying to find a way of saying that rights don't exist. We ought to establish rights. And that brings in duty, of course. You can't think of a right without a duty. Now, how does the notion of a right emerge? I would think from the kind of issues that were spoken of. I totally agree. The emphasis comes on us. We ought to establish these rights. Now, for example, quite a number of philosophers say that rights language is used by the Catholic Church is useless. It's just proclamation. We say everyone's got a right. Well, it's okay, but if you can't enforce it, what's the use of it? I'm trying to say, well, it starts with a moral obligation to set them up in the first place, not just to invoke an abstraction. That's what I'm trying to work out. Thank you.
Perhaps one way to deal with this issue is to go back to the point that I think the panel is trying to make, which is that dignity is a reciprocal, is a result of a reciprocal relationship. So for me, those of us who were born in the tropics, we have no dignity towards a mosquito because a mosquito doesn't treat us with dignity. But we do have dignity towards the earth because the earth gives us a quality of life. We have beautiful beaches in the Caribbean. We have to treat them with dignity. And we need to treat homeless with dignity because they have the capacity to treat us with dignity. So maybe if we consider the notion of reciprocity, we can very easily, in my personal opinion at least, classify to whom we extend dignity or not. I personally don't want to have any dignity with mosquitoes or piranhas or anything like that. They don't treat me well. But I definitely want to have dignity to the earth. I want to have dignity to homeless, to my fellow citizens, my colleagues, so on and so forth.
And then we'll go back.
Well, this distinction raises a distinction that's often made now between our relation to one another as distinct from our relation to the rest of the created order, and that is, as humans, we have the capacity to confer dignity on lesser beings, if I can use that term, on beaches or on mosquitoes or to none. But we do not have that same capacity in our relation with one another. I'm not empowered to confer dignity on you or another person. Instead, I must recognize the dignity that is already there. And so that might be the distinction between our relation to other persons and our relation to animals or vegetables or however far you want to extend it. Oh, that'd be correct.
John, and then we'll go to John.
I was wondering, are there any findings about the relationship of the housing first model and the neighborhoods around which the housing first model participants are living in, and what are the implications for the communities immediately around these? Are they individual families, or are they group homes, or what sort of housing I understand, but
Right.
housing has to be put into context.
Right,
The context around of it is usually a neighborhood.
right.
And do we know anything about that?
Yes. Well, what hasn't been studied is really what the implications are. We know what it looks like. So typically, Housing First looks like you put people in scattered site apartments. So it's again, not concentrating poverty and getting away from the model of having a building, a group home, or a project that has people who have needs, who experience homelessness or whatever in one place, but finding apartments, negotiating with landlords, and saying, we have this person, do you want to participate in this? And then you put people in those kinds of contexts. I think that is precisely the area of research for Housing First that hasn't been done. That we haven't looked at what is the impact on that community, what is the impact on that individual, and how they're integrated or shunned or not absorbed. And actually, at least locally in DC, they have just begun. They have their first Housing First project that's 4 units in one building, which, I just put in a proposal to the MacArthur Foundation to study this exact question, is how do sort of traditional SRO, single room occupancy models for housing people who are homeless address the community, the relational aspects of the dignity of the residents versus these Housing First models. And that's going to be diffused a little bit, because if you're now creating Housing First models that are that look like project-based programs, maybe they've realized that people are feeling isolated, they're not having the social connectedness, that they're not, experiencing and fully flourishing the way they could without the built-in relationships. But there hasn't been, that's a long answer to your question, there hasn't been a lot of research on the community impact.
With the application of the principles that the other persons asked about, if dignity has a mutuality to it, then would it be within the dignity principle to have a community adopt a housing-only project? That is, unless there's dignity to the persons who are receiving and the persons who are getting, and you can interchange these. It seems to me that even if you study the problem, we may be avoiding the question of dignity that is available everywhere or not available anywhere. Because if we privilege dignity for persons in need and not dignity for persons who are providers, then we've just established another cycle of pathology, which, in the 70s, the SROs, they convinced some neighborhoods, particularly uptown in Chicago, that while fewer people were in mental hospitals, that uptown became an insane asylum without walls, to use their words. So, that's the problem.
I think you make a fair point. I guess what I would say from a Catholic social teaching perspective is that we do have a preferential option for the poor, and that we do have to give privilege to people who are homeless, I think, not so that it's a complete imbalance, but I think that their needs and their needs for housing have not been addressed and have not been given privilege, so that we need to privilege their right, if I may, to have housing, but make sure that it is aligned with community needs. That's a good report. You had a question in the back.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the question of conferring dignity on beaches and mosquitoes.
I spelled the correction. Yeah.
Well, maybe not. It's just a question. I could say, why should we confer dignity on a beach but not on a mosquito? Now, one answer you could give would be to say, because beaches are so wonderful and good and wholesome, and mosquitoes are so bad. But then what you've really said is, because beaches, well, of course you wouldn't use this word, but you basically said because beaches have dignity and mosquitoes don't. So in other words, if you confer...
Beaches contribute to our...
well, that's the other alternative. In other words, is it actually an anthropocentric thing?
Yes.
So we confer dignity on the non-human creation insofar as it serves human needs.
Part of our dignity to be able to confer dignity.
Yeah, but we do it for our sake.
Yes.
Okay, but I think a lot of people don't like that account. In other words, they want to say that
That's right.
we owe something to the ecosystem because for its sake, not because it benefits us.
Yes.
So I just wanted to flush out this issue.
Well, that's an interesting conversation. If you want to go there.
There was a hand up before yours, Bill. Do you have a direct response? Okay. Sister, did you have a direct response to this
Yeah,
comment? And then we'll go to
I
Mimi.
get
I'm
very
sorry.
confused by the fact that that humans would have intrinsic dignity and we would confer it on other creatures. My understanding was that other creatures
Good question. Yes.
and others have inherent dignity because God made them. I don't know if anybody can clarify where that comes from.
Well, could I suggest, I just tried to think of that. I hadn't thought of beaches. Since a student once did raise the issue of mosquitoes, so I've been thinking about mosquitoes. Now, I think of an animal that inherent dignity. This is the way I tried to think about it. That my duty to an animal is to foster that animal and support that animal insofar as I can. My own limits lie reached of my nature to become the best kind of animal it can become in accord with its nature. And that works down the line. I still can't, I'm not sure what to say about mosquitoes. But I would support some notion of inherent or ontological dignity in animals because of their nature, which is a gift of God also.
Mimi, and then Bill.
I just want to respond to Tony's comment about inner city Catholic schools, because I think it's a good example of a place where there's a role both for the church and for government. We have a lot of research that shows that these schools are very effective with poor and minority children, and yet we have not been very successful in convincing the Catholic community, no matter how far up the chain you want to go, that they should put a great investment into those particular schools, nor have we been successful in convincing the government to look at those schools beyond the traditional separation of church and state kind of arguments. And I think that's where I know my own frustration comes from, not an appreciation of the documents and statements made, but from actually what happens when the rubber meets the road on what happens with those schools particularly.
Thank you.
Bill?
Well, as I guess I'm getting old, and I just realized that back in 1964, when John Kromkowski was a young man in South Bend, mayor had been elected, who was a conservative Republican, while in the White House we now have Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson had all kinds of scattered site housing programs emerging, but the mayor was afraid that this would only lead to people taking more and more advantage of the goodwill of the Democratic administration. Well, I don't recall the word dignity ever being said by anybody. It was a matter of whether or not it was practical to have scattered size housing, and could we prove it? Well, we did a creative kind of study of all the homeless people over a certain period of time that the city had the registry of, and convinced the mayor that in fact homelessness was not a long-term but a short-term, and depending on a number of other variables, scattered site housing could succeed in South Bend. Well, I got before I left South Bend, they had it, and I never heard the word dignity. I never heard anything about the inner being of people. What I heard was a very pragmatic situation in a city which was suffering from high unemployment and a lack of Studebaker. And so I'll have to go back and read more about that study. And maybe somewhere in there the option for the poor was in my mind, was not in the mayor's mind. But anyway, it can be done. Well, I think we demonstrated that in fact building scattered site housing created an opportunity for people to be in and out within 4 years, moving into very stable situations.
Yeah, let me just be clear that, we have a lot of research that shows how well scattered site housing can work. I mean, the HUD vouchers, right, the Section 8 or Housing Choice vouchers, that's scattered site housing for families and individuals in different kinds of households. What's different about the Housing First that I was describing here, and maybe it would be similar to the Notre Dame study, I'd be interested in the South Bend study, I'd be interested in looking at it, is they're applying this to people with chronic mental illness, chronic substance abuse problems, getting people off the street, and then wrapping services around them. So we know it works for people who don't have those kinds of chronic conditions. And that's what's new, it seems new and different about the Housing First for this population.
I have a question for Father Johnson. What if Robinson, you mentioned Robinson Crusoe and Friday, and if Robinson Crusoe does not respect Friday's dignity, then he's denying his own dignity. What if Robinson Crusoe doesn't want the dignity? What's the implication? As long as it lives in that island, he'd rather mistreat Friday than be have dignity. So,
well, I would say it depends on whether you want to be, I could use this language, in the moral game or not. If you don't want to have dignity, you've set yourself outside the moral game. That's one that I could think of. And if he wants to do so, he's perfectly free to do so.
So then it's really helpless concept in terms of the social problems and things like the people, say, who mistreat the workers or those, so that the language of dignity will not have much bearing on the policy or because they just do not want to be on the moral game. So,
Can I have a thought. If you get out of the moral game, you also get out of the social game. And that's one of the root affirmations. So Catholic social thought and most theory of exchange, that there has to be at least a minimal prior ethical context for any set of social relations to work. Think of exchange capitalism, right? If instead of entering into an economic exchange with you for your labor, I'm going to pay you, I may pay you justly or unjustly, but what if I say, you know what, I could throw a sack over this guy's head and chain him and make him do the work and pay him nothing or just barely enough to survive, and I'd be better off. Now, I can do that. It would be like the man saying, I don't want dignity. But if I do that, then I forfeit any hope of having any kind of social order. So that's...
Yeah, but the moral game and social game, it's...
With Crusoe and Friday, you've only got two people, but if you expand it just a little bit, it becomes clear you can't have a functioning society at all, of anything approaching human beings, even at a most minimal level, if you don't have some prior ethical context.
Like a few days ago, there was a news article on some of the nuns at the Sisters of Franciscan in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
They accused the management of Goldman Sachs earning like multi-million dollars and things like that. In that case, there may be then a degree of moral gain there, but it's a very minimal degree. So the moral gain and social gain being connected, related. I don't know how much the moral gain plays into social gain in that context.
I agree in that context. Yeah.
Wait, let Father Johnston, and then we'll go to Jim. Yes.
Just very briefly, there's a very puzzling statement by St. Thomas that a criminal forfeits his dignity and therefore may be, executed. That's what St. Thomas means. Now, that's always been an acute embarrassment for journalists. But I think that eventually, if you're going to have a society, you have to have coercion. If a society can't coerce people who simply want to abuse others, it can't continue. So if a person says, I couldn't care less about the dignity of anybody, the society is going
base, there's only one kind of relationship you can have to one another. It's got to be reciprocal, and so you take as much as you give as much as you take. But in human relationships, there are various forms, and we recognize those forms. I don't have the same relationship to my wife as I do to the clerk at a store. I mean, there's some commonality there, but there's a clear distinction. I don't kiss the clerk at a store, but I better kiss my wife goodbye. so we recognize this, it seems to me, and somehow or another that would help a bit, I think, to throw that into the conversation.
I would have some thoughts on that in this way of thinking I'm trying to work through. There's a basic level of gift giving in which gratuity applies. Giving of gifts is totally gratuitous. If in our society we have no gratuity, we don't have a human society. But the great majority of our relationships are not ones of gratuitous giving. We have to work, we have to pay, we have to do all sorts of things. And that is where justice enters. So you're kissing your wife is a demonstration of a gratuitous gift of love. You have to pay the clerk in the store just wage.
Any other questions? Steve?
I have a factual question. Given the way that Father Johnston's explained this connection of dignity to rights and noticing that dignity is rooted in some kind of interrelational situation, it seems to me that it's an understanding that's quite different from the normal liberal way of thinking about rights, that sees them, for example, fundamentally inherent in the individual rather than relational and so forth. And that makes me, when I'm thinking about Thomas too, who has actually really nothing to say about rights in the way that liberals talk about it. So to go to Father Pogorel's now, is Rerum Novarum, and this is just maybe someone else in this room knows, is Rerum Novarum the first official statement of the church that takes up the language of rights explicitly? Are there documents before Rerum in which the church talks about rights?
I cannot answer that.
I don't know either, that's why I asked.
And Pontecorn denounced them
Here we
in
have something else.
1854.
Didn't know that. Didn't know that.
And Leo himself, I think, has an encyclical on political conceptions of rights that is I can't remember, it's either just before or just after where he deals with that.
Did you, Bill, did you?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say there's a very important book written in the 90s, and the name of the author escapes me. I'm sure Father Johnston or Father Dan could help me, but he's writing on the genesis of the concept and name of rights, which we usually associate with the Enlightenment. Instead, he's saying it goes back to the medieval canon lawyers. Do you remember?
So it
I
doesn't,
can't think of the name of the
so
author.
it doesn't
Right.
come out of Thomas.
Certainly
it
there's
comes
no-
out
No,
of
no, it does not come out of
Franciscan guys,
Thomism,
okay.
but he's saying it's coming from that period initially, moving from an idea of, it becomes a subjective thing and then develops, it's nuanced, and then it blossoms, of course, in the Enlightenment. But his point is, it's not as if the Enlightenment is a break from Catholic or Christian theology. Instead, in fact, those concepts stem from that originating event. I don't know if you remember the author.
I'm not a medievalist, but again, my medieval canonical tradition would be helpful. A lot of the study of that. Somebody like Ken Pennington probably would be much more on top of that than I would be.
So you would think that the church long before the 18th century would be talking about rights in that canonical sense.
Even before, for example, the Magna Carta and so forth.
Even before
there
the
would be
Magna Carta.
medieval canonists talking, and that would be influencing even some of that discussion leading up to the Magna Carta. Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Shin I just have a brief comment. The latest book to take this up is the latest one of Fukuyama.
Oh, yeah.
It has its thesis is that the social fabric of the West was strongly influenced by canon lawyers.
Oh, yeah.
So I found that a very interesting comment from someone like that. The idea that there are laws that apply to everybody. Now, the only historical point I think we might reflect on, there does seem to be the notion of subjective right. That's the 13th century. But basically, the idea of right was somewhat different. The jus was a right something there we need to sort out.
I think this is a good time to end. Thank you for your participation.
If I could say before you all leave, we've got so many wonderful guests here. We're going to try to do this again in the fall. If anyone would like to volunteer for some of these seminars in the fall, please send emails to the Institute. We'd be glad to respond.